Welcome to Take the Lead Radio with Dr. Diane Hamilton, where she interviews some of the most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, and other individuals who will inspire you to take the lead in your career and personal life. And now, here is Dr. Diane Hamilton.
I am here with Professor Roger Martin, who is a writer, strategy advisor, and currently #1 ranked management thinker in the world. He's the former dean and institute director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto in Canada. He was named #1 in the world management thinker by Thinkers 50. He's also published 11 books, the most recent of which are Creating Great Choices, Getting Beyond Better, and Playing to Win. It's so nice to have you here, Roger.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Diane. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, I have too, and I was really impressed with everything that you've been working on. We met at Thinkers 50 in London, and it's such an amazing group of people to be. What is it like to make it to #1 on that group?
Well, I cannot lie. It feels nice. I guess I was sort of circling around that for a while. I was #6, and I was #3, and I was #7, and so I knew I was sort of on their proverbial radar. But it felt nice, and for me, what I've attempted to do, like Peter Drucker's my hero. Now I know no one will ever replace Peter Drucker or get to that status, but he talked about a lot of things in management. Many of the people who get to near the top of the Thinkers 50 are known for one thing, and so I was pleased that following in Drucker's footsteps and talking about a lot of things related to management was still valued as a contribution, not doing the, I guess, more modern thing, if you will, and focusing on one narrow thing and getting kind of big and important on the basis of that one narrow thing.
Right. You know, I understand what you're saying, because I know that my work with curiosity got recognized, but I like to focus on all kinds of behaviors, perception, and different things that all tie in to business success. And when I was watching some of your talks, I was so drawn to your discussion of Aristotle. Can we get into that? I love that. But before we do, I want to get a background. I mean, you're obviously a nice guy. Everybody from Canada seems so nice, as they always stereotype you. But tell me a little bit of background on how you got to this point.
Sure. Well, it's sort of improbable. I grew up in a town of then 50 people. It's now gigantic. When I go back and visit it, it's got to be at least 200 now. They even put a subdivision of 3 houses into it.
Wow.
So that was in south central farming country in Canada. I then got it into my head during high school that I would do an unusual thing and attempt to go to Harvard College, which I ended up doing, studying economics. Then I needed an excuse to be in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because I wanted to coach the Harvard varsity men's volleyball team that I played on for 4 years after graduating. And my then girlfriend was at Kennedy's, going to go into the Kennedy School to do a master's there. And so my cover story was I was going to do a Harvard MBA. So that I could coach and hang out with my girlfriend. So I did that, and then met up with a bunch of guys in my section and elsewhere at Harvard Business School, including Mike Porter, and helped build this strategy company called Monitor Company in the 80s and 90s. Then, because I was a Canadian living down there, the president of the University of Toronto met me because he was on the board of a company I consulted to and decided I should be his business school dean. And he is a very persuasive man, Rob Pritchard, the single most persuasive man I've ever met. And he talked me into leaving Boston, leaving a relatively high-paying job to do public service as the dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, which I did for 15 years until I term limited out, and so I've spent a bunch of time consulting to CEOs on strategy, running a business school, and writing about strategy, management, and economics. That's what's got me to where I am today, I guess.
Well, you definitely have an impressive background, and are you still the institute director at the Martin Prosperity Institute, or
actually not? I stepped down from that actually and wound up the Martin Prosperity Institute this summer, the summer of 19. It was I like things to be time limited, so this was a time limited project, 6 years as it turned out. It was 5 originally, but I extended it to 6 years, studying the future of democratic capitalism in America. And I wound that up this year, and I'm actually in the process of, in fact, after this discussion, I'll be back with my head in the very last draft, because the final manuscript is due March 1 for my book that's called When More Is Not Better, Overcoming America's Obsession with Economic Efficiency. It's about what's wrong with capitalism, democratic capitalism right now, and what needs to happen to fix it.
Wow, you do get all over the board.
Because
it's all interesting stuff, I mean, well, I want to get into that. I want to touch on that, but let's start with the Aristotle thing first, because
yes.
I found that so fascinating just because of my research and curiosity.
Yes, absolutely. No, I was going to say there's a total tie-in. Yeah.
Oh, well, because just give me the story. His 2 books, the whole thing. I love this whole thing.
Sure. Well, the thing about Aristotle is he is super important to the world because he was the first true scientist and really the guy who created the scientific method. I know we all think that Bacon and Newton and Descartes and Galileo created the scientific method, but essentially they formalized a method that Aristotle in the 4th century BC first established. He established a methodology for demonstrating what he called demonstrating the cause of a particular effect. Right? And his methodology involved essentially experimentation. You experiment enough to be able to say, this causes that. If I have a rock in my hand and I let go of it, it drops, and it drops. It kind of always at this rate, and so we can say there's a universal force called gravity that pushes that rock down. And the book, although actually Aristotle didn't write any books, but he wrote a series of essays that are compiled into what's now called Analytica Posteriora, which is probably the most important book ever written in the history of science, that formalizes his method for demonstrating the cause of a given effect. Now, scientific method. And it's because of Aristotle that we have management analytics and data analytics and all of that, where we say in management these days, well, I need to have the data to prove that this is a good thing to do. Whatever we're talking about is a good thing to do. I've done the analysis. I've been rigorous, and that's it. And that all derives from Aristotle. Now it went through, it went through the Dark Ages where nobody bought into it. Eventually, the Age of Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, and in management, that revolution probably started in the early 20th century with Frederick Winslow Taylor, scientific management, and it's accelerated in the last half of the 20th century, and now data analytics is the coolest thing. So what's the other thing that you referred to, the other book? Well, Aristotle warned the world about the method, right? What he said was I see 2 parts of the world. One part of the world is the part of the world that he characterized in Greek, of course, but he characterized as the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are, which I love the turn of phrase, right? So back to that rock. things cannot be other than they are. I drop that rock and it falls, right?
Mhm.
I drop it here. I drop it in Antarctica. I drop it in India. I drop it from a mountain. I drop it in a valley. It always falls. So it's part of the world where things cannot be other than they are. And what he said is, in that part of the world, my methodology is sound, essentially. And why? It's because if I experiment and take data from the past, right, it is a perfect predictor of the future, because it's the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are. It's sort of tautological. But he said, by the way, there's another part of the world, and it's the part of the world where things can be other than they are. So the example I often use is in 1998, where you tethered to your smartphone and you couldn't do anything unless your smartphone was within arm's length. And the answer is no, because they didn't exist.
Right.
The first BlackBerry came onto the market in 1999. And between 1999 and now, everything has changed so that you can't survive. You get the hives if you're more than an arm's length from your smartphone. That's part of the world where things can be other than they are. And he said, very, very specifically, he said, in that part of the world, do not use my methodology that I've laid out in Scientific Analytica Posteriori. And you can understand why, right? Is if you're analyzing past data to decide what to do in the part of the world where things can be other than they are, you'll convince yourself that things cannot be other than they are.
So if something doesn't exist yet, you can't utilize that thought process because there's no past reason to use it, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, exactly. No data.
Right.
Like last time I checked, all the data in the world comes from one era, the past.
Right.
There is no data about the future, the future yet. And so what he said is in that part of the world, the part of the world where things can be other than they are, the rigorous process for making a decision, because you still got to decide what to do in that part of the world. It's not like that doesn't suspend need for deciding. In that part of the world, you must imagine possibilities and choose the one for which the most compelling argument can be made. And he wrote about that in a book called Rhetoric. And as much as Analytica Posteriori is read, Rhetoric is unread. And so what we think of as being rigorous, right? So when a CEO or a board says to management, well, if you just prove that up, we'll do it. They don't realize that they're offending Aristotle, who would say, well, then you're guaranteeing you're going to have no innovation, no new ideas, no nothing, because that is not how innovation comes about. Innovation comes about by imagining possibilities and then choosing the one for which the most compelling argument can be made. And you see, what Aristotle kind of was getting at is that it's not as though it's all random. You just say, what the hell, we'll try this or we'll try that.
Right.
He said it's the process of argumentation between people that says, well, does this make sense? Does the logic of this make sense? And it's not logic backed by rigorous data, but it's logic backed by essentially slivers of things, analogy. Well, over there, this kind of thing worked, and this is what I think how people operate, so this might work. Yeah, it's possibility
and perception,
there.
Which,
absolutely, absolutely. Which I think gets to your curiosity, Diane, right? Which is, I think, though Aristotle didn't say this, I would interpret what Aristotle did say about the origin of things about of changing the world. Because what he said is the job of human beings in the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are is to understand the causes of the existing effects, essentially, so we can optimize to those. So we figure out that all these people who are smoking cigarettes get lung cancer, right? We can say, well, we got to try and stop people from smoking. So that's understanding the cause of the given effect so that we can do something useful.
Right.
What he said is in the part of the world where things can be other than they are, and I love it. It just makes me happy to say it. The job of people is to be the cause of a new effect, right? Which is kind of great, right? That's your job. Your job is not to understand the cause of the effect; it's to be the cause of a new effect. Well, how do you make that happen? I think you have to be curious.
Right.
You have to say what could be going on here, and you have to be able to, I think, take tiny pieces of observations. And so I think a curious person is a person who is curious about phenomena that might suggest something else. So famously, Johnny Ive, right, the great Apple designer,
right.
When you ask the question, why were the iMacs the colors they were? That tangerine and grape and sort of aquamarine. Where the hell did that come from? The answer is not nowhere and not without any data, but it wasn't rigorous data. It was an observation that Johnny Ives made. And the observation he made is like 20, 25 years before an obscure camera company called Savoie came up with a line of colored cameras. And so think about it. Before that, all cameras were dark brown or black, right?
Yeah, right.
And before the iMac, all computers were gray or brown or black, mainly gray. And this camera company says, hey man, maybe we can do something that's frame breaking here. And sure enough, come out with this camera line, and with that were quite successful, although everybody was like aghast almost that, how can you make a camera tangerine colored? But guess where Johnny Ive got the exact Pantones for the iMac?
Yeah.
From that. Right? So I would argue he had curiosity about, this is a consumer product. This is how people conceive of it. It's black or brown. What if I broke their frame entirely with an everyday object that they're used to being a certain color, and broke their frame? That could, not everybody will like it. Some people probably will be revolted by it, but some people will love it. And while I'm at it, why don't I use the exact colors, because it sure as hell worked for them. I don't think a non-curious person could ever come up with that, because he or she wouldn't be curious about what was going on there in that other situation that has some relevance here, not data-based relevance. Johnny Ive could not have gone to anybody and said, I've got the data that demonstrates this will be a success. And in fact, even though people think that Steve Jobs was responsible for the iMac because it was the first big product that came out after his return from exile, and it's sort of true and not true, it was apparently sitting ready to go in Johnny Ive's lab, but he couldn't get approval for it because it was too weird and radical. And again, there are apocryphal stories. I don't know for sure, but the story, whether apocryphal or true, is Jobs, when he gets back, goes to see Johnny Ive, sees the iMac in his lab or his offices, and what the hell is that? And Ive explains it to him, and he says, "We're going into production." And so he didn't create or conceptualize or anything that was somebody else. But because Steve Jobs did not have a rule in his mind that says you have to prove with data everything before we do it, said we're doing that. That's a good idea.
Well, it's an interesting story, and it makes me think of things I've seen Steve Jobs talk about how he thinks you need to go to your customers to find out what they want before you create it to some extent, where Elon Musk has kind of said, I didn't ask, I kind of just created. And but then Steve Jobs also used his calligraphy to create fonts. How much do you go out there and ask people what they want, or how much do you rely on your own inquisitiveness? There's so much to innovation that requires curiosity. Yes. But it's kind of interesting to see two of the most successful minds and how they differ in that respect. Don't you think?
Yeah, although some of it, I think both Musk, my view of both Musk and Jobs is they are disinformation machines. Right? They I don't think Steve Jobs ever gave away his methodology for anything. I think there are many smoke screens, and so I think you have to watch what they actually do, not what they say. And I guess I believe, and I don't know who said it. Who said it that you have to be a world-class noticer? Was it Oscar Wilde or somebody?
Like
made?
Could be. I'm not
yes,
sure.
yeah. But I like that notice that notion. That I think the world is so chock-a-block full of an infinite amount of weird and wonderful data, if you will, observations, things you can observe, that the most youthfully creative people have a filtering system that causes them to notice some things and not others. Because if you say to this person, well, you should be observant, what kind of advice is that? Like,
right.
That's like, duh. Yeah, the opposite is, as I say, if the opposite is stupid on its face, it isn't a particularly worthy idea. And so, of course, you should notice. But what?
Right.
What should you bring into your brain versus let float essentially past your eyes and ears and nose? And so to me, people who are usefully creative, right, which is creative in a way that other people say, oh, I'm glad you did that creative thing, as opposed to why the hell did you do that? People who are usefully creative, I think, have a way of participating in the universe that causes them to gather up snippets, pieces of ideas, data, observation that enable them to say, well, maybe this will work.
Yeah. Well,
and I do think that getting closer to, if you're trying to build something that you're going to sell to people, getting closer to those potential buyers, users, is just a good thing. But the people who are great innovators don't just do that. They also have this sort of system dynamic view in their head of what about what that person I've observed that person would like, could I actually produce, whether it's a product or service, at a cost that I could imagine they'd be willing to bear, and that I could produce in a systematic way enough to serve those people. There's both this, you have to have a way of thinking about users and what things they might be missing that they don't even realize, and then a productive system that would enable you to deliver those. And those two things have to be integrated together to have a useful idea rather than a novel idea.
Well, it brings to mind some of the things I looked up in my research on curiosity of divergent, convergent thinking, and some of the stuff from George Land that he did with NASA. And I thought one of his talks that he gave was interesting when he talks about how he likens it to divergent and convergent thinking to putting on the gas and putting on the brake, but he says the problem we have is that we do them both at the same time. We do it too quickly. And if you put on the gas and the brake at the same time, you don't go very far. And that's kind of what we do with our ideas. We come up with these great ideas, but then we overthink and criticize them. And I think that's what I'm hoping to work with people with, the curiosity aspect. And I know you have some great examples of your work with Procter and Gamble, with all these companies that you've worked with. I know you talked about Olay and what they've done. I'm just curious if you had any examples you wanted to share of how companies have really utilized curiosity to overcome status quo thinking, and what they did that you thought was especially helpful to them.
Well, sure. And maybe before diving into examples, I can also say that the techniques that I use to stop people from getting negative quickly on an idea is my favorite question, which you may have read, which is what would have to be true. And so if you were to say to me, Diane says, "Oh, Roger, I think this would be a great idea," rather than I say, "What's your data to support it? Can you prove that to me?" I say, "Okay, Diane, let's do a little exercise. Let's figure out what would have to be true for that to be the awesome idea you think it is. What would have to be true about customers? What would have to be true about the distribution channel? What would have to be true about potential competitors? What would have to be true about our capabilities? What would have to be true about the cost structure?" So you build a picture of the things that would have to be true for that to be a good idea. Right? Then you can go and ask the question, not are those things true? Because the answer is mainly no.
Right.
for a good idea.
Create these things, right.
Exactly. Then you can say, what would we have to do to make each of those things true? Well, customers have never heard of this, and so they wouldn't flock to, well, what would we have to do? We'd have to create some kind of a a program that would enable people, would-be consumers out there, to experience it. Okay, so we have to sample it or do this or that or whatever. So what I try to do is make it into a creative exercise of asking the question, can we make enough things true to say, yeah, this is a good idea? Can we imagine a plan to make enough things true? And that keeps it in the positive domain rather than evaluation by way of essentially critique and looking at the shortfalls. It's evaluation by looking at what I call a happy story. Tell me a happy story of what this would look like. Yeah. And then let's work backward from the happy story to say, well, what stuff would we have to do to make that happy story come true. I don't know. And in terms of examples, so many things. One of the things that was a fun one was I had the great privilege of working with one of the smartest women I ever met, Tina Brown, on the turnaround of the New Yorker magazine. She famously turned around Vanity Fair and then got put on the tough job of turning around the New Yorker, which is kind of money losing and sliding dramatically. And one of the challenges of the New Yorker was, because of what the New Yorker had been, because at one point it was absolutely the dominant magazine, and in terms of selling ads, it sold at the highest dollars per page in all sort of metrics, but it no longer had that advantage and was struggling, and was, if the Condé Nast folks hadn't bought it, it would have probably long since succumbed. So we had to think about how could you get people to pay high rates for ad pages when if you looked at the demographics of the New Yorker reader, they weren't actually as rich as people think they are. They weren't actually as urban as people think they are. They're mixed men and women, about 50-50, which is, by the way, the worst mix you want for a magazine because advertisers, exactly. Advertisers much more like a woman's magazine or a man's magazine. It's not like one is better than the other, but 50-50 is the worst.
Right.
So we had to come up with what is it about New Yorker readers that would cause you to want to pay a higher premium per viewer, higher CPM than you would for competitors, because that's what we were selling. And what occurred to me was that there is something different about New Yorker readers than the reader of an average magazine, which is that the New Yorker reader is a curious person, so back to your stuff, who's interested in the latest thinking across a whole bunch of domains. Because, if you think about the New Yorker, there'll be articles about politics, there'll be articles about science, there'll be articles about sports, about everything under the sun. And so that's also bad for advertisers too, because they'd rather have it be, again, targeted, as you said. But at a cocktail party or a dinner, who is everybody going to be listening to? It's going to be the New Yorker reader who is current on the most interesting subjects of the day, regardless of the topic area. And so what is the New Yorker? The New Yorker is the perfect launch vehicle. So if you're advertising just the next upgrade of this car or that car, nah. But if you're launching a brand new SUV, a brand new drug, a brand new movie, whatever, that's what you need the New Yorker for. And so it was sold. And it was true. Like and this is just not hype. This is absolutely true. And so part of the turnaround of the New Yorker was selling it as the launch vehicle, and selling to advertisers who were launching something new and distinct and needed to generate buzz. And the way to generate buzz was to have New Yorker readers knowing about it, thinking about it.
Well, that's really interesting. I had not heard that story, and I think that just showcases the importance of all the question asking you do. I love that you ask so many questions, because that's just so exactly what I like. But
yes. I have very
about,
few answers.
compared
to the mysteries out there, right?
No, but you advocate for asking so many questions in your book that you wrote with Lafley. Lafley, is that how he says it? A.G. Lafley?
Yes, A.G. Lafley.
Yes. He was the former CEO of Procter & Gamble, and you have written a book with him, and that's been
called Playing to Win.
Very popular, right?
Yes.
And in that, you talk about asking 5 essential questions, which are really important to strategy choices. And I was thinking of all that while you're talking about your stories. Those questions come up in so many respects. And you gave a talk, I think it was with Des from Thinkers 50, where you were talking about Olay, maybe?
Could be.
Could have been. But you said that they did a lot of these, went through this process. So I want to talk about those 5 questions quickly, and then I want to talk about your most recent book. But
sure.
So what are they, and why are they important?
Well, they're the 5 questions that lay out the logic of strategy. And what you will notice, Diane, in my work, that I ask more questions about logic than I ask about data. So when you think about it, 2 things are conflated in the world that I don't think it's helpfully so in people's mind. They think of this thing called analysis. You've got to analyze stuff. And I think analysis is 2 things. It's a logic structure to which you add data.
Okay.
Right. And so logic structure would be something like, well, I think that the bigger the factory is, the more it can spread its fixed costs, so the lower cost per unit you'll get. That's a logic structure.
Okay.
That suggests something. Data is, okay, we've looked at 100 factories of varying sizes, and sure enough, bigger is cheaper. When you're talking about the future, there is no
we're back to
data.
That.
Yeah, back to that. But then people think you can't be, quote, analytical. I say you can. You can have the logic very precise. Then the question is, how do you produce some data into the future that will help you confirm or disconfirm your logic? So these 5 questions, so I'm not answering your question. These 5 questions are about the logic of strategy. What's your winning aspiration? Where will you play? So where will you plop yourselves down in the playing field? Over here, over here, over here. Where will you play? How will you win where you've chosen to play? What capabilities would need to be in place? for you to win, where you've chosen to play, and what management systems are necessary to build and maintain the capabilities that enable you to win, where you've chosen to play to meet your winning aspiration. So those 5 questions lay out the logic of a strategy choice. And so I try to get people to think about that, to say, and actually to come up with a bunch of those. Here's 5 choices that would work together. Okay, put that on the shelf. Here's another one, and here's another one. And then and only ask what would have to be true about customers, the company, competitors, that would cause that logic structure to be more valid than not. And then what can we do to try and make that a reality? So I start from the logic structure of those 5 questions and work backward into the data, with a recognition that the way to do something new and cool is to create the data. You've got to prototype and try stuff to figure out how we have to modify it to get the result that we want.
Well, as you're talking about all this, I really was interested in your discussion about how to produce data into the future, kind of thing. And because I get a lot of questions about what data is out there to prove that curiosity helps improve innovation, or curiosity helps improve engagement, or the productivity, or whatever it is that they're trying to solve. And there really isn't research specifically on the questions that they ask. So how do you produce a solution or data for, that type of a thing for people who want to say, how can we know that this is going to work? How much money is this going to save us? I mean, do you deal with situations like that haven't been researched yet? What's your answer
all the
to
time.
those people?
All the time. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the reasons why I wrote the Aristotle HBR article with our friend Tony Goldsmith-Smith. Is that one of the things you have to help these people understand is what Charles Sanders Peirce, this great American pragmatist philosopher, said 100 years ago: no new idea in history of the world has been proven in advance analytically. So often when people say to me, can you prove that new idea, Roger? And I'll say, well, that would be the first time in human history that's ever been done. I mean, we can give it a whirl, but don't know. So for me, what I try to focus on is the kind of person that you're referring to, that we're talking about, is the kind of person who I call reliability focused. They focus on producing consistent, replicable outcomes, whereas you, Miss Curiosity, are what I'd characterize as a validity oriented person. You're interested in producing an outcome that you actually want. Right, so a reliable train will get to the station on time. A valid train will get to the station that you want it to actually be at, and those are not the same thing. So for a reliability oriented person, the problem for them with the future is there's no data from the future, so that anything about the future is to them entirely speculative. Right. So the future is kind of useless. To the validity-oriented person, and you can test yourself on this, Diane, you're fascinated with the future, right? We could do this. We could do that, right? And that would be cool, right? You're focused on it. That just scares the bejesus out of the reliability-oriented person. So what I say your job is, Ms. Validity, is to productively turn the future into the past. Now, how do we do that? What do I mean by that? What I mean is that what you've got to do to the reliability person, or for the reliability person, is to say, I'm going to try this prototype. It's not going to be terribly expensive, what the designers, like IDEO designers, call low res. And I'm predicting that the following will happen. If I'm wrong, it ain't going to kill us, because I haven't spent a whole bunch of money on it. Right. But if I'm right, then we will have data. And so the problem with the next 6 months right, is it's in the future, so there's no data. That's the bad thing about the next 6 months.
Yeah.
The good thing about the next 6 months is that in 6 months, there'll be all sorts of data.
Right.
Looking backwards, because you'll be standing there looking backwards. But you do have to do it productively. So if you don't tell the person that,
yeah,
then it doesn't count. This is like Babe Ruth pointing to center field and then hitting it out. So what you've got to do is say, here's what I think is going to happen. And then often, if you bring the reliability-oriented person along on that little journey, when you get out there, they'll turn into, kind of the wacko saying like, why haven't we done more of this already? We should blow this out.
Biggest
but
fan.
It's own. Yeah, they're the biggest fans. So I think the best innovators are the ones that figure out how to productively turn the future into the past.
Yeah.
They do that by not doing something that's so dangerous for the entity, right? They say we got to do this in a way that's not going to be a shot below the bow, the waterline if it fails, and they involve the people in it who need that kind of proof, because there just are reliability-oriented people who just won't do what you and I will do, which is to say, I believe this, and I'm going to do it. I mean, that's what I did as dean of the business school at the University of Toronto. I said, I believe this and this and this, and we're just going to go do it. So I was boss, I could do it, and we build a little momentum, and then people would let me away with more. It is good to be king. They would let me away with more and more stuff, and it was all happy. But that is not.
Well,
that is not always the situation.
Yeah, what you're saying is kind of what I'm doing with Novartis right now. I'm working with Verizon, Novartis, and other big companies, and at Novartis, one of their employees is writing her doctoral dissertation on curiosity, and is using my curiosity code index and other assessment to measure, to get the data. And that's what we're doing, is a little test group of 200, 400 people, and then you move on to the rest of the organization once you get your data. And I think that really works for a lot of companies. And I love how you describe that, because I think all of this all ties in to my next book's on perception. So all this is tying in. Oh,
good. Perception is a seriously tricky subject. That'll be good.
Yeah.
There needs to be more on that. Like, why is it that people's perception of the same thing is so very different, right?
I think
that's one of life's most interesting questions.
Well, I think you pull in IQ, EQ, cultural quotient, curiosity quotient, a couple CQs in there, and it all kind of comes together for me when I was researching it. And I think that everybody's so focused on cultural quotient and certain things, but I think it all it's so holistic to add it all together to see. It just really pulls in the empathy part of them. I wrote my dissertation on emotional intelligence, so I'm fascinated with all of that. And I think it's all so important in the end product. So that's why I'm fascinated by the title you have when you mentioned your new book, What's Wrong with the Democratic Capitalism.
Yes, although before we go there, can we do something first?
Yes.
I think for your work on perception, if you haven't read it, you should read my 2009 book, The Design of Business, because there it goes into this reliability versus validity thing, and I think that dramatically shapes perceptions, and people are either reliability oriented or validity oriented, and that may be helpful to you in your perception research.
Oh yes,
so
it definitely would be. And I think it's so hard when you're writing about perception, because there's perception of everything. You know what I mean?
Right.
Whether you see blue or you get gold on the picture, or there's whatever it is. But I think what I was trying to focus on was in the business world. If you wanted to open a business, say in Africa, and how you're perceived by people who want to do business with you, or if you want to open a business in Canada, it's a little different. Wherever you are. And I think it was more meant as a global. How just so you're able to see people as, or see yourself as others see you, and not be so stuck on only your own perception of the world. And I think that's just such a fascinating thing to look at for just doing global business. So
absolutely.
So, but my perception of what's right, what's wrong, and that's why I wanted to talk about your last book.
Yes.
because the perception of, you're saying what is wrong with
Yes.
democratic capitalism. Can you give us a little
Yeah.
teaser on your book?
Sure. So what I'm focusing on is that democratic capitalism, American democratic capitalism, worked in a certain way for 200 years, from 1776 to 1976, for the first 200 years of independence. In virtually all the years, like 90+% of the years, the average family in the country moved forward, right? And that's really important, especially the median family, right?
Yeah.
Because if you want democracy, everybody gets to vote, and the majority gets to form the government. And you want capitalism, which is basically most productive assets are in private hands, and most markets set the prices for things, as opposed to a planned economy like the Soviet Union 5-year plans, where we plan everything. So if you want capitalism and democracy together, it's super important for the median family to be moving ahead, because they're metaphorically the swing voter.
Right.
And if they don't move ahead, they're going to say, well, how's about another system? And for that 200 years, democracy and capitalism in America produced just that. Since 1776, the median income increase has dramatically flattened. So the median family in America is not getting ahead at any kind of reasonable pace anymore. The last time that happened was the Great Depression. And in the Great Depression, the good thing about the Great Depression, or two good things about the Great Depression. Good thing number one was the top 1 in 10% suffered more declines than the median. So Americans could say, this totally sucks, but at least we're all in it together. And the other thing is, it didn't last all that long. It was painfully long for the people perceiving it. But if you look back on it, an average family in 1929 had recovered by 1939 their income level, and in another 5 years, so in 15 years, their income had actually doubled from 1929. So at least it came back fantastically, and everybody was in it together. In this more recent period, it's going to take the family at the current pace, it's going to take the median family of 1976 100 years to double their income, as opposed to 15.
Wow.
And we're not in it together. The top 1% and the top 10%, but especially the top 1%, are doing better than they've ever done in American history, and it ain't even close. So there's a divergence between the average American and the high-end economically American, and I think that's dangerous to democratic capitalism. And in the Great Depression, most of Europe plus Japan went either communist, fascist, or heavily socialist. America shifted somewhat to the left. Franklin Delano Roosevelt New Deal was a leftward shift politically, but still staunchly democratic and capitalist. I'm saying that currently we are playing with fire on that. Now, I started this project in 2013, before we had Bernie Sanders and running for president. But what's now considered highly acceptable by at least young voters, socialism. So essentially, what I predicted would happen is happening, which is people are deeply questioning whether democratic capitalism can work. And so the book is about why that's happening, why it's working differently now than it worked for the first 200 years, and what things we can do about it. And that'll be out in September.
Well, I'm really looking forward to that. I'm thinking of in a perception angle of your view of capitalism from a Canadian standpoint versus a U.S. standpoint, and I think I know you said that every professor should consider what problems that you could solve. So, what's the
Yes.
problem you're trying to solve with this book? Are you just shedding light on the issue, or do you think that by reading this book, are we going to be able to solve a problem?
No, that's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
This book is an unusual book in the genre. Most of these political economy books are 80% here's the problem and 20% here's some fixes.
Right.
This book is 40% here's the problem, 60% here are the fixes. There's a comprehensive program that says if you want democratic capitalism to survive and thrive in America, which I do,
Mm-hmm.
right? I like many, I started out outside the U.S. I do love the U.S., even though it's unpopular now to say that,
Uh-huh.
and I think you know, I frankly worry a great deal about the success of undemocratic capitalism in China.
Hmm.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
it's doing great with illiberal, undemocratic capitalism. I mean, they still say that it's a communist country, but they're embracing all sorts of capitalism in the most illiberal, undemocratic fashion. I want democratic capitalism to win because I believe that everybody should have a vote, and that is how you should run a country. So this book, the purpose of this book, is to help America go back to essentially leading the world as a model for you can have a well-functioning democracy
Mm-hmm.
and capitalism working together. People are questioning that now, and not without some reason. It's because we've made some mistakes in the way we think about and perceive
Right.
the economy and how it works, and I want to change that. We perceive it as our model of the economy is as a perfectible machine. It's not. It's a natural system. It's a complex adaptive system, and we've got to start managing it as a complex adaptive system, and that means executives, business executives, political leaders, educators, and citizens have to behave differently and in several respects, and adopt I think a more realistic model of how the economy actually works.
Yeah, well, I like the title. You kind of, when you get attention when you ask questions like that. It reminds me when I interviewed John Tamny about why we don't need the Fed. I think when you ask these questions about, why is this not working, or what is wrong with this, I think that's very provocative and it gets people thinking. So I'm really excited since you're the number one thinker in the world. And I love all that you're working on. We covered so much today, and this is so much fun to talk to you. And I'm so glad because we didn't really get a chance to chat in London, and I was really looking forward to this. Thank you so much for being on the show, because this is just a wealth of information, and people could use this so many different ways for so much that they do in their business, Roger. And I know a lot of people want to probably find out how they can get your books or reach out to you. Is there some kind of link or thing you want to
Sure.
share?
All the stuff that I've ever written is on my website, which is www.rogerl, my middle initial is L for Lloyd, rogerlmartin.com. So you can find it all there. And my Twitter is at Roger L. Martin.
Well, Roger, a lot of pressure on you to stay number one. So
I will do my best. I will do my best. But this was a pleasure. Be happy to do it anytime.
Oh, thank you. And I hope to see you at the next Thinkers 50. And I really going to check out that section of your book again on the validity and reliability, because I think that's a great discussion for perception. So thank you again. And we will be back right after this message.